High near 43 and a wind from the east. New precipitation amounts between a quarter and a half an inch possible. Tonight, rain likely, mainly before 1 a.m., patchy fog, otherwise cloudy, an overnight low of 40, northeast winds, and the new precipitation probability for overnight is another quarter to a half an inch. Monday's weather, partial sunshine and 50 degrees. Tuesday, mostly sunny and 40. Wednesday, partly sunny and 37. Thursday, mostly sunny and 36. Friday, partly sunny and 42. And on Saturday, mostly sunny skies with a high near 48.
We're local and live at 99.5. Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
How does an archaeologist get drawn into UFO research? Is there really debris from crashed UFOs? What happened to the Lanolier?
Welcome to the 1024th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live and on YouTube. Well, that was Ben Eno, and I'm Tim Swartz, here to help things along. Paul is with us too, coming in via Skype.
Here I am.
Well, hello there, Dad. Lovely to have you with us, and perhaps even grace us with some interesting questions. So,
Well, I'll speak as I'm able.
yeah, take your time, Dad. It's good and therapeutic to have you with us, and I'm sure everybody else enjoys
Thanks,
having
man.
you with us as well. So, coming to us from the UK via Skype today is Mark Ollie. He is an author, musician, historian, archaeologist, and lecturer, best known for writing and presenting the ITV Grande Sky History Channel's popular television series, Lost Treasures. In Europe's Roswell, 40 years since impact, Mark presents his investigation in a series of internationally important hidden mysteries. And if you have any questions, listeners may call in. That's 401-766-1240, or you can email Paul at behindtheparanormal.com.
Mark Ollie, great to talk with you. Welcome to Behind the Paranormal. So, what was Europe's Roswell and why?
Okay. Hi from the UK, where we're all freezing to death. It's very cold over here. At the
We're
moment.
wet over here, so...
Right. Europe's Roswell. Well, it's a UFO crash with a lot of very startling parallels to what happened at Corona, which is Roswell, New Mexico, back in 1947. There's a huge number of parallels. Only this one occurred in a small Welsh village called Llanilla, just outside Aberystwyth in mid-Wales in the UK, back in 1983. And I've just written a book about it, so that's why you guys want me on here.
Mm-hmm.
I presume you've got some probing questions to ask.
Yeah, we do the best we can. But yeah, give us a little bit of the event, what happened, and
Okay.
and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, okay. Well, basically, the story goes that early in the January of 1983, during the night, something crashed on a farm about 2 miles outside Llanilla in mid-Wales. And the following day, a farmer called Irwell Evans, got up to tend to his sheep. And when he came out to have a look at his fields, these fields being quite large fields, 4 of them were covered in debris. So his first response, looking at all this debris, is, well, I must have had a plane crash. You know, something's come down in the middle of the night. So he phones the local police, and the local police say, well, we've not had any other reports. They then contact the nearest Air Force base, and the Air Force say, well, we didn't have anything out that night. And then a couple of hours later, the Air Force, the police, and another unknown agency, we assume the men in black because they're wearing suits, turn up on site. And these guys in suits are ordering everybody else around. And as Irwell put it, it turned into like a scene from a James Bond movie, because there's all these vehicles and they're clearing the fields, they're taking the debris away. And nightfall then creeps in because it goes dark early here in January. And they decide they're going to do it by floodlights. Well, the floodlights go on. They carry on clearing all of this debris. Gets to about midnight. Well, Irwell's a farmer, so he has to be up the following day to tend to the same animals all over again. So he kind of says hi, bye, goes to bed, gets up the following morning, and it's gone. All the debris completely disappeared. But then the story takes a bit of a turn. A couple of weeks later, there's a guy called Gary Rowe, and he runs a UFO group, if you like, observing group in North Wales. And he also gets things from the National Clipping Agency, News Clipping Agency, because this is before the days of easy access to the web and things like that. And he gets a newspaper clipping in the post. And basically, Sunday Express, which is a big national paper, and it's an article that says UFO crash in Wales, Clonilla, and it mentions Irwell. Now, Wales is not massive. It's not an enormous place. And it turns out that Gary has actually got contacts with Irwell. So he contacts Irwell by phone and he says, well, what's going on? And Irwell says, well, you can come down if you want and have a look. So Gary goes down to the crash. The fields have all been cleared. But it looks like whatever it was that crashed hit the top of the trees in a neighbouring wooded copse. So Gary's like, okay, I can see this huge, plough through where this thing's come through, took all the top off the trees, knocked all the trees in all different directions, scattered wood all over the fields. He says, I don't care how good they've been with the fields, in the dark, they're not going to be able to get the metal out of this woods. So Gary and the team that are with him dive into this wooded area and they get probably about 6 pieces of metal and a couple of pieces of foil. They then decide they're going to go back in a week's time. So they go back again, and this time they don't really recover anything, but then they decide to go back with metal detectors. Now, before they get a chance to have the third visit, he gets a phone call, Gary, from Irwell, and Irwell's saying, you're not going to believe this, they're taking the forest away. And Gary's like, what do you mean they're taking the forest away? He's like, well, they're bulldozing it. They're destroying the forest. They're taking it away. So Gary then gets on the phone to the local forestry commission, and he says, what's going on? Why are you taking this woods away? And the guy on the other end of the phone just goes, well, it's wind damage. And Gary's like, do you normally take a forest away for wind damage? And they're like, no, but in this particular case, that's what we're doing.
That's one way to
Gary
deal with
said
it.
Well, yeah, Gary said the guy on the other end of the phone sounded like he was almost laughing, you know what I mean? Because it was ridiculous. So that left Gary then with these pieces of crash debris. And you can already see from that account there's parallels to Roswell, because one farmer, one big debris field, one military, operation stroke cover-up, very, very limited press coverage. I mean, there was one newspaper that ran the story for Roswell. There was only this one article in the Sunday Express, and so on. It really has parallels. But then it meant that these fragments, these pieces of whatever they are, UFO debris, it meant that Gary ended up with them. Do you want me to carry on with the rest of the story?
Yeah, please. I mean,
Right.
we're getting the events. We're drawing parallels, and we can go from there. I think what's important is getting the details, and then we can.
Right. Well,
expand.
there's a little bit more juicy to this. Then
Ooh.
Clearly they knew what Gary was up to because they took the woods away. So somebody was watching the site. And I mean, when I did the documentary of this is how I got involved as an archaeologist. Gary contacted me. And he said, do you fancy doing a dig or seeing what you can find and, accompanying metal detectorists on the site and all that? Well, to be honest with you, there was nothing. The site, no chance of getting anything off the site. There was no flying discs sticking out the ground or alien bodies or anything like that. There was a bit of structural debris with the stuff on the field, but whatever it was had clearly hit the trees and flown off. So there wasn't really anything for me to dig up. So I'm sort of not sure quite where Gary's coming from at this point. Then Gary says, but I've got a case with some bits in, if you want to come and see those. And I'm like, right, physical remains, I can deal with that. That's something that's in my scope as an archaeologist. Anyway, we went and we filmed the whole story as a documentary in 2008, because that was 25 years after the crash. And then once we'd finished filming, this is where Gary told me an extra story. Because he took me on one side and he said, I didn't really want to put it on camera. He said, but you can have this as a story. He said, probably end of Feb going into March. He said we'd recovered these bits of metal. They'd flattened the woods, and I get a knock on the door. And he said, as I'm walking up to the door, I can see two figures in black stood outside. So he said, I opened the door, and there's these two guys, exactly like you imagine, black suits, black ties, black hats, dark glasses, incomprehensible passes. And he said, I glanced up the close, he said, and there's two SUVs parked in the close, all the windows blacked out, no number plates. He said, so it's clearly military or upper echelons of military. And one of these guys just said, well, Mr. Rowe, we'd like our material back, please. And Gary's like, well, you can't have it. And this fella's like, what do you mean we can't have it? He said, Gary said, well, I've broken one of the pieces up into tiny fragments. He said, about the size of your little fingernail. He said, I put them in key rings. And he said, and I've sent them out to all the people I know who've got connections to the media and all these people in ufology. He said, have got these key rings. He said, and as long as you don't come back, I won't tell them to release them to the media. So at this point, the men in black are like, oh, okay, cat's clearly out the bag, nothing we can do. So they just, walked away in silence, got in the cars, drove off, never to be seen again. But very clearly, not only did they know that the woods is where the crash was, not only were they instructing for the cleanup, they also knew that Gary had been mucking about on the site and got these fragments. So they clearly knew he had them and who he was, where he lived, and they turned up on his doorstep. So very obviously he was being watched, So that brings us pretty much up to date. The only analysis that Gary could get done on the material, over here we have British Aerospace that build aeroplanes and stuff like that. So he sent a fragment through friends to British Aerospace, who said, well, this is not part of anything we're aware of. It doesn't look like any of the planes we've got at the moment. And from the very brief analysis that they were able to do, because back in the 80s it was thousands of pounds to analyze metal. So they did a very brief analysis of it. They said it looks like duralumin, which is an aluminium alloy that's been around since the days of airships, since the days of the First World War. So it looks like duralumin, but that's all we can tell you. There's a green paint on there that's not aerodynamic. There's some resin that's holding stuff together that we can't identify. And on another piece, there's a sort of a rubbery coating that forms a hexagon pattern. And they said, we're not really sure what that is either. So that was where we were in 2008. That's where we were when the documentary came out. If folks want to see that, by the way, it's on YouTube. You can go and find it. Europe's Roswell. It's out on release again. We've repeated it. So that brings us up to now. Do you want to know a bit more?
Actually, I have a quick question before we hop into the Wayback Machine and shoot forward.
Okay.
So it occurred in 1983. This obviously isn't 1940s America,
No.
right? The response was very different. But the parallels that I see in the phenomena are there. The one thing I wonder is, besides your documentary, was there any sort of news coverage or anything, or was this just swept right under the rug?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. We didn't have marsh gas or weather balloons or anything like that. They didn't come up with any kind of excuses for it. But because it came down in such a remote part of this country, I don't think they felt the need really to cover up the crash perhaps in that way. Interestingly, only the Sunday Express ran it. There was a guy called Andrew Chapman that wrote the article, and we contacted him for the documentary in 2008, and he's a fantastic news guy, great editor chap, and he kept his notebooks, and he said, leave it with me. He said, I'll go back to my original notebook. I'll see if I can find the source of the story. So he went back, and then he phoned us back a few days later. He said, you're not going to believe this. He said, the best I can do is, he said, I think we came back off the New Year break. So that'd be around about, 3rd or 4th of Jan or whatever. And then somebody came around the office with a big stack of stories that they wanted writing up, which is what they used to do back then. And he said, I must have been handed the story to write it up for that edition. He said, because I've got no record of where the story came from. We have no idea. And that's where it gets odd, because there are no other publications that ran that story, local or national. It just came out in that one newspaper. It's absolutely true. eyewitnesses, people on the ground, everything. So it must have come from either the local police or the local Air Force or somebody else involved in the recovery, because there were details in there that don't quite match what Irwell said. Which actually adds a lot of credibility to it, because every now and again you get something that just doesn't quite fit. So clearly people are not making this up. They're not all singing off the same hymn sheet. It's different information each time.
Right.
And there was a couple of bits about there being girders were writing on and an aerial. Well, Irwell doesn't remember any of that at all. He said there were bits of structure and then just lots and lots and lots of this flat metal and tin foil everywhere. So he doesn't remember anything, no girders, no writing or anything like that. But then if you put that in the equation, I mean, it sounds very similar. The whole description sounds incredibly similar to what came down in Corona, what crashed at Roswell. It's just very, very similar.
Interesting. Now, why the I don't know if I want to call it deforestation. That's essentially what it is. What was the reasoning behind it? Did they ever explain besides wind?
No, the only explanation that Gary ever got was wind damage, and that was from the Forestry Commission. But because, I mean, in Wales, it's a, everybody knows everybody else kind of scenario. So clearly the guy on the other end of the phone was he knew he'd been told to get rid of the woods. There's no doubt at all in Gary's mind that this guy had been told to get rid of it. And obviously it would have been extremely difficult to extract all the metal fragments from the woods. Gary said they recovered a couple of tiny fragments that were stuck in the trees, actually embedded in the timber. So clearly they weren't going to get all of it, So they were acting under orders, basically. That's where that ended up.
I just wanted to comment real quick here. The pulling down of the trees sounds very reminiscent of when Gary Jones was on the show on November 5th talking about the Denby lights. And he said a couple of weeks after the lights were seen, the forest underneath that area were completely pulled down. And this, I guess, was a really old forest, had been there for, hundreds of years. Yet within, I think he said 3 to 6 weeks, it was just completely razed.
Exactly the same, identical. And it would be the same commission as well. It would be Forestry Commission. So clearly there is what we would call a playbook. There is a way of dealing with this kind of thing.
It's so interesting. It makes me think of Travis Walton and his experience and the trees around where he was abducted were warped almost. And you kind of see that in some other cases where the ground is warped or there's, elevated radiation or something like that. But I think it's interesting to remove all of the trees. I'm perplexed as to what the reasoning is, unless it's, any sort of evidence, right? If there's anything that gets messed with in tree rings, any sort of anomalies or anything like that. Or maybe there's some sort of mutation that occurs. Who knows? Definitely a can of worms to kind of delve into. But yeah, I digress. So as an archaeologist, how did you find yourself saying yes to doing a dig for this kind of subject?
Well, as soon as Gary sort of put the evidence forward and there was actual physical evidence as well already in existence, from my point of view, it's trowels in the ground time. And it's, we can use geophysics, ground penetrating radar, we can use metal detecting equipment, things like that. And I was quite prepared to, throw the full might of my archaeology unit at that site. And Irwell was quite prepared to let us. But when we actually got there, we had a sort of similar wilderness challenge to the challenge that has been presented by Roswell. I mean, they have metal detected on Roswell, and National Geographic did soil analysis and got metal particles off Roswell. But we've got the same situation really in Wales, where in a sense it is a desert, because just below the grass level, below the soil level, it becomes limestone. It's an incredibly hard, rocky valley. So there would be a limit to how far we could go archaeologically in actually, finding stuff on site. I'm not saying that Gary and his team got all of it, but surface clearance would certainly seem to be the way forward rather than digging. because all we'd be doing is looking for the bits the military missed, and most of it, vast majority of it, was sat on the surface because it rained down as debris from the sky rather than impact. I mean, it would have been nice, if the thing had actually hit the ground, because there'd be loads and loads of stuff we could dig up. It'd be like, Second World War Spitfire doing a vertical dive into a field. You tend to find tons of stuff, and it's very, very difficult to recover all of it. But in this particular case, it just didn't turn out to be that way.
Interesting. So,
and also I was going to say I am an eyewitness of UFOs as well. I was a believer, as it were. 1976, I saw something flying overhead when I was a teenager, a sort of a star-shaped thing that bounced around the sky and did some pretty amazing aerobatics. And then also in the 1980s, I saw something that looked a bit like the scout ship out of Close Encounters coming up the local valley. And then all the lights on that went off and it shot off into the sky like grease lightning. So I'd already had those two encounters. And as an archaeologist as well, when you're out in the field, doing excavations where you're camping out and things like that, a lot of my team had seen things as well up in the sky. We did one particular dig in Derbyshire, and some very large silver saucer-shaped thing apparently came down and buzzed the campsite, flew over the top. So I had quite a lot of fairly panicked archaeological diggers on that particular one, wondering what on earth it was. So I think Gary came to the right chap, and I've always had an interest in paranormal and parts and all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of how I got involved.
We always find that there's crossover phenomena, right? So we see that there's UFO activity. Sometimes there's ghosts. There's Bigfoot. There's all sorts of other odd things that can happen. Whether it's like the Rendlesham Forest incident. Around that time. Not even around that time, but historically, right? There's stories of fairies and the Green Children of Woolpit and all these other things. Did you find that there were sort of similar events that kind of happened throughout history in this area?
It's an interesting area. Even in recent history, I'm going to stay with recent history because there aren't many legends as such. But you mentioned things like the Denby Lights. We have got this definite area where certainly for 40, 50 plus years, there's been a lot of unidentified flying object activity. And a lot of it's documented. I mean, you mentioned the Denbighshire Lights. I saw my occurrence a little bit further north in the Mersey Valley. There's been eyewitnesses have seen things coming up out of Cardigan Bay, which is coming up out of the sea, and flying inland. So basically, you've got it's kind of the North Wales Triangle, if you like, and it goes up the coast, it goes inland and up the Mersey Valley, and then you can join the 2 points together, and it encompasses probably 5 or 6 Welsh valleys and this area known as Snowdonia and an island called Anglesey. And it's renowned to the point where the local lifeboat station has a phone number, and every time they see things coming up out of the ocean, they can phone the local Air Force base and report it. There's open channels in that area historically between people concerning these things happening. So the fact that we got one that actually hit trees and the fact that we got debris off one, in a sense, does not come as a surprise because there are literally hundreds of other reports spanning an enormous amount of time in the area that this happened. It's almost surprising that it hasn't happened more than it has,
Did it? Yeah. I mean, well, as time has gone on, at least here in the States, I can point to that there's a sort of stigma around, reporting UFOs or seeing them. So, but nowadays that stigma's kind of gone away a bit. People feel more comfortable, especially with organizations like the Mutual UFO Network and all of that, where they offer these very sort of professional means by which you can report these things, especially if you have an open line right to your to your Air Force. That I would say that offers some sort of security when you're seeing something that obviously racks your worldview, correct? And I guess before we take our break, actually we could take our break now, and then we can kind of go into the future, and we can talk about what you've discovered recently. So you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, with Tim Schwartz co-hosting, as well as our wonderful guest Mark Ollie. We are talking about Europe's Roswell and all sorts of other fascinating topics, and we will be right back right after this.
Introducing Bowling for Milk. Join your friends and neighbors at Walnut Hill Bowling Lanes on Sunday, December 10th from 2 to 5 p.m. for strikes, spares, and maybe a few gutter balls, but plenty of fun at Bowling for Milk. Just $25 gets you 2 strings of bowling and shoe rental, and the milk fund gets half. To add to the fun, we'll have a mini auction for just those in attendance, including an item donated by the New England Patriots. And ON Radio's Cruisin' Bruce Palmer will be on hand to spin the tunes and sign autographs. The Patriots don't play that week, so join us for Bowling for Milk, Sunday afternoon, December 10th from 2 to 5 p.m. at Walnut Hill Bowl on Diamond Hill Road, Woonsocket. It's a party to help the Milk Fund.
ON Radio.
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
Welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM radio here in Blackstone River Valley's beautiful Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And we're talking today with Mark Ollie, with our wonderful co-host Tim Schwartz, and we're talking about Europe's Roswell. And we're going to hop into our DeLorean here and go right into the future, and we're going to move from 2006 onwards, and we're going to talk about all the things you've been discovering recently, Mark. And you don't want to give too much away because you still have your works and such to advertise a little later on, but let's give some highlights.
Okay. Yeah, it's been really interesting recently because basically Philip Mantle at Flying Disc Press, who is the publisher who's put this latest work out, he contacted me and said, well, we're going back about 2 years now, and he said, it's coming up for 40 years since this UFO crash. How do you fancy reopening the case? So I was like, yeah, okay, because it was, as I said, largely unresolved. We hadn't got any analysis, and we hadn't got anything sort of definitive from the MOD or whatever, Ministry of Defence. So we thought, right, we'll go for it. So we did a Freedom of Information request, and of course they said they had absolutely no idea that anything had happened. It wasn't one of theirs, etc. So nothing was added there. But then we decided, Philip decided he was going to ask Gary, would Gary let us have some samples for analysis? Now, at that point, I'm thinking, okay, well, Gary's managed to hang on to this material for 40 years. He's not going to give it up lightly. He's very protective. He doesn't keep it at home. He keeps it in a lockup. Very rarely does this stuff ever see the light of day. So, of course, we're in communication with him all the time about doing the book and things. And Philip contacts him and just says, well, Gary, do you think there might be a possibility of us having some samples? And Gary's like, well, yeah, maybe. So anyway, we thought, oh, that's not going to go anywhere. Anyway, a week later, he gets a jiffy bag in the post with 3 samples in it. So Philip's over the moon. He says, this is amazing. We can actually analyze it. So we decided we're going to do like a double test. One set of analysis we sent off to Australia, and the other one we sent off to America. And the first one to come back was the Australian one. And Australia comes back and it says, yes, we know what this is. It's not duralumin, it's aluminium foam. At which point, me and Philip are like, aluminium foam? What is aluminium foam? Well, apparently they can mix stuff with aluminium that makes it foam and then go solid at room temperature. And what you finish up with is a metal that's extremely light, extremely strong, and quite versatile. But then they also came back in the analysis and they said, yeah, and, some of this grey resin stuff we've got on here, it's just a particular type of glue from America. So, our conclusion is this is one of ours. So at that point, we're thinking, okay, this is going to be interesting. And then the American analysis comes back and they say, you open the first page of the analysis and in big letters it says substance unknown. So we're like, oh, right, okay. And then you get the breakdown. I mean, I've got a little bit of the breakdown here. I mean, you're only talking tiny percentages. You're talking about, I think the greatest amount here is 4%. So you got titanium, manganese, irons 4%, got nickel, copper, zirconium, and then 94.6% lanthanum or lanthium. At which point we're like, okay. And the grey resin, they can't identify. The green rubbery substance with the hexagons in, they still can't identify. And the green paint on the Australian sample, they've not identified that either. Now, we'd made an assumption early on in this process that all the metal was the same, because it all looks the same. But clearly it's not the same, because the stuff that went to Australia is the stuff with this green paint on. That is clearly aluminium based. The stuff that went off to America with this green rubbery hexagon coating on it, that's a different material. So you've got two different parts here. So that was the first bit of discovery, is that we've actually got different bits of material, plus the fact we never got the foil tested. So that's still out there to be done. Anyway, this stuff comes back, and then the lanthium's interesting because it's quite common, lanthium. It's all over the place. It's number 27 on the ranking of most common materials on planet Earth.
Yeah, it's used
So
in
it's up
vacuum
there.
tubes and cathodes, right?
Oh yeah, it's all over the place, but it's also it's up there with things like mud and quartz and basalt, and it's everywhere.
Yeah.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, it's also in the upper atmosphere. It's in outer space. It's in comets, meteorites, galaxies, and other planets. So it is literally everywhere. But then there's two important factors here that come into play. The first factor is both substances were totally unknown and did not exist in 1983 officially. So that's your first thing to consider. And if it was flying around in the sky, let's say in the end of 81, the beginning of 82 or 83 when it crashed, chances are that technology would have been in development for a number of years. So actually, what you're really looking at is the late 1970s. They would have had the ability to develop that technology over 3 or 4 years out of the late 70s into the early 80s before that thing ever got airborne. So that's your first consideration. And the second consideration is when you're dealing with something like lanthium, it costs tens of thousands of dollars to extract. So if you want to get a decent amount of it, you're looking at millions of dollars to extract. And you're still talking about 1983 here, So you've got a substance, millions of dollars to extract, shouldn't exist, knocking around in 1983, and enough of it to cover 4 fields. That's about the size of 2 football pitches in debris. That's an awful lot of extremely expensive exotic material. So when you actually look at that, all of a sudden, me and Philip thought we were going to solve it. We were being clever and thought, we'll get the analysis back and it'll be a piece of helicopter fuselage or something, But no, it's actually made the situation worse because we have got alien, quote, exotic material that should not exist. And we've only managed to identify probably about 20-25% of it because there's a shed load of other stuff involved in that we haven't been able to analyse. Both labs couldn't analyse the resin properly, which we think is what the Australians are saying is glue. And clearly the Americans are saying it's not glue. So that contradicts. They've not identified the paint. They've not identified the rubberized coating. And we've not had the aluminium foil analysed. So, and what you were saying as well in the previous question before the break, when you said, what about supernatural and unusual things, happening? Well, when they came to micro-photograph the lanthium metal, even after 40 years, was giving off some kind of a field or a signal that actually distorted the photograph. So the macro photo that was taken of it is distorted. And we've put that in the book. You can see it, and it's in the report. It says we had a hell of a job photographing this because it distorts when we try and photograph it. So rather than answering the problem, I think the rabbit hole just got deeper.
So Mark, any idea what kind of purpose that lanthanum could play in the body of an aircraft of some kind. I mean, have you looked in to see if there are any, like military applications, or if it's, been used before in, say like just your jet fighters or things like that?
When we started off, I'm going to say there's three analyses. So analysis number one was the British Aerospace one, and a couple of comments that were passed at that time. They said, well, this is a very pure alloy. We've not seen anything like this before. That's what they said. But we do know that the duralumin that is being used, duralumin, by the way, is just a trade name. It's like, McDonald's or Coca-Cola. They said the duralumin that we're using, because there are 200 different varieties, is not the type that we're looking at here, but it's used in the control surfaces on fighter jets, the ailerons that direct the vehicles. That's where we were in the 1980s. This stuff that we've got now, which is the same material but with a better analysis, nobody has the foggiest idea where this stuff's from or what it could be used for. I think the aluminium is probably the internal shell. I think the duralumin is not the duralumin, the lanthanum. I think the lanthanum is the outer shell. And I think that the foil we've got, the tin foil, goes between the two. So what you end up doing is you end up with a thickness of fuselage, if you like, or shell, with the lanthanum on the outside and the aluminium on the inside. That's how I think it'll end up working out. But it's interesting because the bigger pieces of, especially the lanthanum, they're all either concave or convex, depending on which way you look at it. And Gary quite graphically demonstrated how strong this big piece he's got is, because you can stamp on it and it won't collapse. It does have peculiar qualities, the lanthanum. Gary noticed if you attacked it with a hammer or a drill or, a mechanical cutting device, it pushes back, it resists, and you can't do anything with it. But if you actually go at it as if it was a piece of eggshell, and you try and snap little bits off using a pair of pliers at slow speed and slow energy, you can do that. You can get bits off it, that way, which again leads me to say, well, it's obviously designed for high pressure, high speed, high resilience, or a force field or an atmosphere of some kind. But when it slows down and it gets hit by trees, it smashes, it shatters like eggshell. And that's how we ended up with it all over these fields, So there are like little bits like that you can sort of put into place. But no, certainly not in 1983. There was nothing flying around the sky that had anything remotely resembling what we've got now. And if anybody out there does happen to know what it is, so far they're not saying. They're keeping stum about it.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Because that's such an interesting angle that you don't really hear too much about. I mean, obviously, right? The tinfoil, duh. You see that in Roswell, etc. But there is this theory that I've heard posited many times, and maybe there's something to it, maybe there isn't. With Roswell here in America, that the tinfoil that was used was then sort of reappropriated and then released to the public. And in this instance, perhaps it is sort of the same with the lanthanum as well. Perhaps it is that something was reverse engineered or something like that. I mean, we will never know, but that is a really fascinating sort of aspect to it, because it does add a lot more questions to it.
Yeah. I mean, subsequent to the analysis, you're absolutely correct to say, could it be back engineered? So the sort of three answers, if you like. The first answer is it's one of theirs, in which case it's alien and it comes from somewhere else, and maybe it was an alien ship that came down at Roswell, or then the other answer is it's one of ours, in which case it's super technology and nobody's talking about it. And then beautifully put, you've got the middle ground. Is it back engineered? Is it something we're doing, so technically it's one of ours, but also it's one of theirs? Is it as a result of stuff that has come down in the past, and we've appropriated the material and started to do things with it? I'd love to know the answer. I don't think I go quite as far as that in the book. I mean, I have to say in the book I present the evidence.
Right.
I give both of the analysis reports in full, but then I go very, very lightly in terms of making conclusions. because I'd really like to know. I'd love to know what the actual answer is, But yeah, nicely put. It could very well be back engineered.
It's all just a theory here, folks. But it's but it is interesting to think about because what happens with the debris? Where do they take it? What do they do with it? Obviously, as somebody who is at least vaguely intelligent, I would say that perhaps all right, some alien technology landed here. What do we do with it? I wouldn't lock it away. Maybe there's something we can do with it. Right, that would be my logic anyway. But logic dictates that it is about time for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, Mark, where people can find out more about you, about the book, and then we can kind of hop into the last quarter of the show and talk about conclusions, implications, etc. So where can people find out more about you, find out about the book, etc., and what you're working on?
Okay, I'm going to keep it really simple. I like it when things are simple. I've got 9 books out in total, and they're all on Amazon. Everybody can get them on Amazon. So type my name in. You'll find one about Disappearing Ninth Legion, one about Robin Hood, one about the Green Man. With Philip, I've got the Crystal Skulls and Human Heads. I've got Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph and Arthur, which is a really fantastic book on King Arthur. If anybody's into that, go and check that one out. And then, of course, I've got Europe's Roswell, 40 Years Since Impact. So they're all the recent ones. There's a few others. Go and find me on Amazon. Number 2, if you want to have a look at some back catalogue and stuff, there's a company called Drake Michigan. We've just spent 9 months putting all of my production work up on YouTube. So, get stuck in, go and see what you can find. Lost Treasures, the ITV Granada Sky History series is on there. You forgot to mention in the introduction as well, I also did the last series of Ancient Aliens. It's fairly obvious if I've got an interest in both areas that inevitably I'm going to finish up on there. I think I'm in the episode on crop circles, but that's out there somewhere. I'm sure folks will find that. And then number three, if you want to contact me, I'm on Facebook. Send me a friend request, as long as you've not got a photo of an angel and your name's Fifi Trixabel and there's nothing on your site, in which case I probably won't accept you. But as long as you're a real person and you come and say hi, and you can chat with me on Messenger. So that's Amazon, YouTube, Facebook. There you go.
Interesting. Oh yeah, no, go check them out. So I guess we literally right on the dot here for the quarter of the show. Brevity. I guess one of the really interesting things that I find about the paranormal in general, right, not just ufology or anything else, there's this idea that the Greeks had, which is essentially there's a few different ways that we deal with knowledge, and we think in different ways depending on what we're doing with knowledge, right? So you have knowledge, like technical knowledge, also known as techne, scientific knowledge, also known as episteme. You have they include doxa, which is the knowledge of public opinion, and nous, or noetic, if you want to call it that, which is spiritual knowledge, right? So the argument being that you can find all the data that you want, you have all the statistics, you have all of the evidence in front of you, right? But it still requires knowledge of public opinion in order to interpret all of the evidence you've accumulated. And that's the hard part, because inevitably we're all going to be influenced by different things, and we all have our biases, and we have all of our experiences that inform our experience of the objective reality, in which case, right, we have all these substances, we have them analyzed, we have the data, they are unknown, but what do we do with it? And in this case, Mark, what do you do with it?
Oh, that's a belting question. That really is a good one. Oh dear, first time anyone's quoted Greek at me when they've asked me a question.
Welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
10 out of 10. Fabulous. That's a brilliant question. What am I going to do with it? Well, from my point of view, having the information that I've got and the evidence that I've got, in the next 12 months, I'm really going to take it on the road. So in a sense, I mean, I've done the spiritual bit, I've done the physical bit, I've done sort of the intellectual bit. But there's no substitute for taking something like this into the realms of public opinion. It needs to go out into the public domain. So I'm producing a PowerPoint on it. I've been booked for a few different conferences this next year, in the UK, that is, and I do tend to tour the UK as well in the autumn, sort of August through to December. I've just coming to the end of one now. I've got 3 bookings left, and that's it for this year. So I'm going to do that next year. Number one, I'm going to really take it out on the road and see what folks say. I mean, there's no substitute at the end of the day for coming face to face with the general public. You'd be amazed, that one day somebody might creep out of the woodwork and say, well, I was involved in developing things for British Aerospace in 1981, 82, and I can tell you, and poof, out it comes. They may not go on record, they may not make it official, but I'm sure in the next year that there'll be more answers. And no doubt a few more questions as well. I'd like to finish the analysis. It's not going to be a cheap thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do because we haven't got a limitless supply of this material, but certainly I would love to do a little bit more analysis. And from my point of view, as you say, it kind of ticks all 4 boxes, all the knowledge. It doesn't matter which avenue you take it down. It clearly straddles all of that, It could be quite mundane, it might just be a bit that's dropped off some enormous aircraft, that we've been building. I mean, they've had 60 years plus since Roswell. They've had 90 odd years plus since the Second World War. So yeah, fine, it might be ours, but then there's just that possibility that it might not be, in which case, where does it come from? So and in the PowerPoint, I'm going to get a bit more speculative because when you're live, you can afford to do that and talk a bit more about dimensions and time travel and probably some of the things the Ancient Aliens chaps will be interested in. I'm going to go and fall off the edge of the flat Earth.
Well, I guess on that note, I suppose it's almost like taking a step outside of the ivory tower of academia. It's very. You're getting out of the echo chamber and kind of moving into the realm of the people, I suppose. The people, I guess. How have you had colleagues in the archaeological world react to any of this, or do they just brush it off, not care, not a big deal? We're stuck in trying to learn more about the Anglo-Saxons than worrying about this.
I've had a really nice mixed response. I have to say, we're all terribly British, don't you know, over here. It's all done very English and all that. So we don't tend to have bust-ups in the quad. It doesn't happen.
Not as fun as it is over here.
Quite the same way. Yeah, it doesn't happen in quite the same way. So I think up to the sort of early 2000s, I think everybody just had me down as a dedicated dirt archaeologist, which I was, but with a lot of other interests besides. With the different societies and different things I was members of and friends I had and what have you. It was quite clear I was about as far over left field as you could get, And then I landed the ITV Granada series, 22 episodes, which is not bad going over 5 years. And that went out on Sky. And all of a sudden, the archaeological community, it was like I'd arrived. They were all like, hang on a minute, this guy's doing TV. I was giving other shows like Time Team and what have you, I was giving them a run for the money. We were getting enormous viewings. I mean, we predate Ancient Aliens. I'd argue we set a lot of the ground rules for that. And it was a crossover show. It wasn't just archaeology, it was reenactment, it was spirituality, it was mysteries. It was a damn good show. Go and check it out. It's on YouTube. But then after I'd finished doing that, I think a lot of the archaeologists came forward and they said, do you know what? We're going to start giving you information. We're going to start giving you the material because it'll threaten our careers, but it won't threaten yours. And that, seriously, that I was so flattered, especially, I mean, I can't name them, but there was a couple of guys that were instrumental in giving me material for the book on King Arthur. There's a lot of archaeologists out there are convinced that Arthur's real, that he exists, and a lot of the mythology, if you like, on the Welsh side of things, a lot of that has got roots in fact. We've actually dug some of the sites up. So it's taken me on a journey where it's pushed me outside of what you might call normal academia, but at the same time there's a hell of a lot of people in academia who I personally feel are sort of cheering me on. I see myself as an outlet for some of that material, and 80% of archaeologists, if they're being honest, we've all had supernatural and mysterious occurrences and finds and things like that, and we use dowsing and psychometry and all sorts of stuff which never make it into the official academic record, and that's been going on for years.
So interesting, because I've heard so many different stories from different sort of wings of the sort of the historical studies, I guess you could call them that, sort of the broad spectrum, not just archaeology, but like Egyptology and things like that, where if somebody approaches something with a slightly odd take, or perhaps something a little out of the box, they're just met with, "We're not talking about this." They close the door, done. And it's that's very refreshing, honestly. If anything, that's the most scientific approach, because you consider new possibilities, and I think that's wonderful, actually. And I do think...
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting you mention Egypt, because, yes, the Egyptians are incredibly touchy, because there has been, I would say, a lot of over-theorization of that. There's been some theories have, gone off into the stratosphere and clearly are unsupportable, I personally have got a reputation, I'd like to think I've got a reputation for holding things down. I am very sort of, if it quacks like a duck and it shoots like a duck, it's a duck. I like to have something in front of me that I can anchor on. So I don't... I'd like to think I'm sort of the voice of reason. I don't kind of go off on a flight of fancy, which again brings us nicely back to Europe's Roswell and all this debris. Had we not had the debris and the eyewitnesses and everything to go with it, chances are I would never have been involved. Certainly not as a producer. I would never have done the documentary in the first place. So I'd like to think that's where I'm sat, but that helps. I think it gives people confidence in what I do, and I think that's why people speak to me, I think, ultimately.
Interesting. So what do you think, as we come down to the last few minutes of the show here, I want to ask you to kind of weigh in on what the future of ufology would be. Is archaeology the way to go, sort of looking back to look forward, or what's your opinion?
I'm going to use that magic word, disclosure. I think disclosure is the way forward. I don't think there's any other answer for that. I think there's a lot of people out there. It's like the us and them, the great divide between the us and them. I'm sort of at the top end, if you like, of normal, average, everyday, ordinary people. And I've gone as far as I can go. And I'm hoping this book is kind of, scratching at the door of disclosure, because the people who do know about these things and do have all the information, the distance is so broad now, it's gone so far. That needs closing. That's where the disclosure comes in. The book, in a sense, is show and tell. It's got loads of photos, loads of things in there that people can see. And basically, the message I'm sending out is, look, guys, we've got pieces of whatever it is that you've got flying around. So you may as well tell us what it is, because it's in the public domain now. It's scratching at the door of disclosure. So I would certainly, over the next few years, like to have some answers, and I think the general population deserves some of those answers.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, but I don't know. I don't trust anything the government tells me, let alone if they're telling the truth about ufology. But that's a different debate for a different time.
Well, spoken as a true fan of the X-Files.
How'd you know? But Mark, it's been wonderful to have you on. Everybody, please feel free to go check him out. Amazon, YouTube, all sorts of wonderful things. Mark Ollie, everybody. And I guess now that we're coming down to the wire here, we can hop into our announcements. There are a number of great books by our friend Nick Redfern for sale temporarily at dowserssouthwest.com/Greater New England UFO Conference. There is also a link on that to our homepage. That's behindtheparanormal.com, and you can check out all sorts of wonderful stuff there. And I believe that Tim is going to tell you a little bit about that.
Yeah, visit that very website, behindtheparanormal.com, where you can find nearly 1,200 hours of our regular shows and special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio, Achieve Radio, and here on WOON AM and FM. Also, hear many of these broadcasts on the major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
And we don't want to forget about the charities as well that we have on our page, which anything from USA Cares, Canadian Veterans Advocacy, Help for Haiti's Orphans. We also have the Sisterhood of Ground Zero on there as well, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America. That's all on our charity page, along with many others that we have adopted over the years. And these are charities that we care about and that we know people that are involved with. So you can check out our website, behindtheparanormal.com, and check out those charities.
So what's going on next week, Ben?
Well, next week, in one of the most important broadcasts we have ever done, we have retired Bridgeport, Connecticut police officer Joe Tomek, who joined my dad and Ed and Lorraine Warren in tangling with the Lindley Street poltergeist of 1974. This is Officer Tomek's first radio interview in 49 years, and we actually had the pleasure of going to see him when he was local. It was probably in the spring of last year, and man, it was like the meeting of two old friends. It was definitely an experience, and it's going to be a really, really amazing show that we're going to have on as well.
I look forward to listening to that show. That sounds intriguing. But we'll leave you today with a thought from Zig Ziglar. You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. I'm Tim Swartz.
I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey. And we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Broadcasting live and local daily from the Navigant Credit Union broadcast studio at the corner of Park Avenue and Kennedy Street in Woonsocket. This is ON AM and FM.
WOON, Woonsocket.
And now, Premier Networks proudly present Casey Kasem's American Top 40, the 80s. This week's presentation is